Greetings, everyone, and I'm really glad to see you all tonight at another episode of Unscripted Stuff. So, today I have another topic to discuss that I found interesting, and perhaps I hope you will too. And that is, why are people attracted to villains? Because if you ever dig into any community of fan community of a game, of a movie, maybe of TV series, you've probably seen that sometimes fans are just simping over characters that, well, deserve anything but compassion and love, because they are just plain assholes. And this is what I wanted to talk about today. I'm guilty of that myself, before you ask. And I've prepared actually a little. I've cheated. This is not 100% unscripted. I've made some notes and I'll look to them. Oh wow, blackout has just ended, and this is amazing. And now all my home appliances started making sounds, which is great. Alright, so let's begin. But before we dive into our conversation, here is a nice, not too hot, maybe just very warm cup of tea. This one's for you. I have another one for myself right here. Right, you can see it, but it's here. And let's begin. And I also wanted to note that everything you'll hear from me either comes from Google or my own conclusions. So if you have anything to add on the matter, if you disagree with me, if you have different opinion, or just want to share some thoughts, you're welcome to this section of comments. I honestly might not always answer them quickly, but be sure I read them all, and this is one of the most fun parts of my life right now. So, let's begin. I'll peek into my notes, and we'll begin with a little bit of history. And don't be in a hurry to skip this part, because it might be beneficial for us to understand how even society came to the point where we started to favor villains, bastards, assholes instead of main heroes, or along with main heroes of any story, really. In the 40s, in the 40 years of previous century, the first comics began to appear, and the first characters you all know, like Superman, Batman, and Captain America, Wonder Woman, and all that classic bunch. And they were usually fighting against Nazis, because the World War II has just ended and it was a very relevant topic. But with time, the interest to the, another fight against Nazis that virtually were not a threat anymore, people began to lose interest in that. So different kind of stories began to appear. There were just detective stories, some adventures, some thrillers, and of course they contained some scenes of violence, of cruelty, maybe of some crime scenes. Just as a coincidence, at the very same time, the crime rates among teenagers began to rise. And when police took some young criminals and interrogated them, these kids, among other stuff that happened to their life, they also mentioned that they love reading comics. And of course, you wouldn't think that society would consider the root of all problems, the poor economy, the social problems, the maybe some violence or toxic relations in their families? Of course not. The comics, the stories with pictures, were chosen to be a scapegoat to the kids' crimes. The comics code authority was created. It's kind of a system that controlled the level of violence in the stories with the pictures. So everything was censored really bad. Detectives and horror stories were censored so much that some of the series were even cancelled. Alright, now somebody's using the elevator. Cool. Although that comics code authority, CCA, as far as I know, weren't the last instance of justice, but the stories that were disapproved by CCA sometimes even were rejected by big publishers, and also from fantasy stories were removed any, attractive bad creatures like vampires and all that stuff, or they were just downgraded to be a parody of their former selves. And for example, at the same time, the Joker, main villain in Batman universe, as far as I know at least, which used to be a cruel psychopath. He was out of his mind. His tricks were usually very, very terrifying. He was like downgraded to some pranker. I think you might remember that movie. I can't recall who was the actor playing Batman, but the Joker there actually wasn't the Joker we see nowadays. He looked more like really like some pranker for kids. Many stories lost its popularity, and because their plots were basically unoriginal, and this is when comics became a form of media mainly for kids audience. So if you meet some really old person, some boomer who tells you that comics are for kids, don't be in a hurry to judge that person. Maybe the last time he opened a comic book was in the 60s. So yeah, at that time the comics were really mainly read for underage audience. The main heroes of these stories should become so perfect, so flawless, so obedient to the law, to the government, to society, that they basically stopped being interesting because no real human could relate themselves to these heroes. Well, maybe somebody can, not me in that case, that's for sure. Many stories began to lose their audience. The Batman series was on the verge of canceling at all. Some smaller publishers, they printed the comic books for more adult audience, like in underground conditions. They were not sold in the big distribution networks or that stuff. But in the 70s happened what is known as Bronze Age of comics. The censorship was softened. Some whole banned genres returned, like horrors, maybe some thrillers with really adult twists of plot. And yeah, the plots became to have more tension, more violence, they became more realistic. And the most interesting part, that the main heroes, the saviors of humanity themselves in these stories, became more realistic. They stopped being like Jesus on steroids. They got human weaknesses, human flaws. They could have like alcohol or drug addiction. They could make mistakes and have some heavy consequences for their wrong decisions. And of course, such heroes required more complex villains, more complex than previously when they were just evil because who knows why. So yeah, they could return the classic Joker in all his glory, and you got the point. With time, CCA lost its power finally, and comics became more and more serious. Somewhere around closer to 2000, there were a series of comics exceptionally for adults, for adult audience. Somewhere around new millennia, the new idea were presented like in mass media. The fight against the system, whatever that means. Because at that time, when in modern society, more and more regular person had to be effective, efficient on their job. They have to be obedient to the law. They have to be always smiling and pretending to be okay, to not bother others with their problems. So the more some government-controlled media translated the thoughts of necessity of being nice and obedient for people, the more it kind of caused a backfire when people became more and more attracted to some rebels, to someone who goes against the tide. I'm sure you might be, or at least you know that person who maybe some decade ago had some Joker or Rorschach or Tyler Durden on their user pic, and maybe even some quote from that characters in their user profile on any social network. With time, all that evolved into whole movies and series dedicated to the other side of justice. The brightest example probably is the TV series The Boys, that are totally opposed to the ideal, superhero system. Yeah, or maybe such. You probably seen that movies like Maleficent, like Cruella. Maybe that TV series about Loki. I did not watch that, but as far as I'm concerned, Loki used to be a villain in Marvel Cinematic Universe. Now, when we figured how the world got to this point where everybody is simping for the bad guys and girls and whatever genders there exist, when we justify the villains, when we love them sometimes more than main characters of the whatever media that is, let's see what are the reasons for that from the point of our human psyche. And I'm not a psychologist, so this is all just my conclusions. First of all, if you like villains, if you ever, rooted for the antagonist of the story more than the main protagonist, probably everything is okay with you. That's not a problem at all. That's not a reason to be concerned. So let's go. The first reason is the villains, the good villains, not that villains that are just evil because fuck you, that's why. But the good written villains are usually closer to us regular people, because unlike main heroes, they have flaws. They usually have some drama behind them. A good storyteller always will tell you how they got to this point, how the world and society rejected them, so they decided to become an asshole. And they suffer, and we sympathize for them because we can take pity on them. We can relate ourselves to those villains who has flaws just like us, who make mistakes just like us. Honestly, I can tell for everyone, but for me it's usually easier to relate myself to the character that has some real problems, real weaknesses, real flaws, have some sob story behind his background, and that's much easier to sympathize a loser than sympathize, some king who lost his throne, or some demigod defeated by other demigod. Like, what the hell? These are the problems from another world for me. I cannot relate. Unlike us in real life, the villain just takes one extra step to pull out stops and become an asshole and exact revenge on the world, on people who hurt him, her, them. Besides, villains, bad guys, they're usually a good, safe space, so to say, for our psyche to explore our own dark thoughts, our violent thoughts, maybe some inappropriate for the society thoughts. And it's kind of unacceptable if you just come to work tomorrow and tell your boss and co-workers that you just hate them, or in real life when you are annoyed by someone, you cannot just punch that person in the face, usually. But it's absolutely socially acceptable if you just put Dio from Georgia on your user pic to show that kind of protest. Another idea is that villains, the bad guys, are a good safe space for our psyche to explore our own, bad thoughts, violent thoughts, inappropriate for society thoughts. And in real life, you usually can't just, punch every person that annoys you in the face, or just come to your job and tell everyone that you hate them and set the office on fire. But we find it enjoyable to relate to such characters in the movies, in the games maybe. I still recall the game Postal 2, which was a huge relief for me, a way to, blow out the steam that accumulated from my problems in the university, because art university is a living hell, at least the one where I was. And yeah, it was a really good time when you come home in the evening annoyed and bored and angry and with some problems, and then you just do all the nasty things in the game and all the ugly things in the game. And in real life, this helps you to maintain your stability and be nice. Some of the villains also represent a power. I'm not talking about miserable villains and pitiful villains, but some of them that are performing their crimes on a global scale, like on a scale of a planet, of a galaxy, of a universe, the existence. They may be attractive for us because we are naturally attracted to strong personalities, to someone who actually has the balls to pull that plan of destroying the whole planet just for shit and giggles. So that's another thing as well. Another thing is that they are unpredictable and interesting, because especially this is the issue with anime, that I figured the main character there is mostly, usually, not everywhere, but still, kinda bland. It's so average, like it's a human created with the default settings. So I think the creator's idea is that everyone will relate to this character if he or she doesn't have any noticeable traits. But in reality, this is just plain boring. And the villains, that's where usually authors get really creative. Of course, that does not consider all villains, but some part of them. Another thing about unpredictability, I believe this word exists, is that with the main hero, we kind of know how the story will end. Optionally, this hero may live or die, but he or she will solve the main problem of this universe. Otherwise, what is this movie even about? So there, everything is kind of predictable. But with villains, it's always blank space. We don't know. Will they be defeated? Will they die? Will they crawl away and suggest that they will make a comeback in the future, leaving some cliffhanger? Will they change their mind and switch sides and just begin to help the main character? Yeah. Will they redeem their sins, or maybe they will resist until the very end? Another point is that the villains are usually badass. This goes also for some main story protagonists in modern days. And we are attracted to badass people, well, mostly. Because many of us wanted to be in their shoes, at least for some time, feeling their power to do anything that comes to their mind without consequences that they would care about. And yeah, we love that feeling of risk. And I have to mention this archetype of attracting villain, like a rebel, only works when the world where this villain is placed is some kind of restricted. It has some limitations, yeah, or maybe there are some rules that cannot be broken. Because if the fictional society actually works well, do not restrict its inhabitants from doing what they want, then these villains will probably just look marginalized and will not have that big army of fanboys or fangirls, maybe. And we also have to mention the good looks of so many villains, because for a long time in classic literature, because of conservative approach, homophobia, transphobia, all kind of phobias to everything unusual and not understandable, these traits were considered bad. So the villains usually had to look overly sexualized, some freaky in some way, as opposed to the righteous, nice, and refined main character. Also, this can also be found in many Soviet movies. Don't know if you've seen any, but it's not that rare that, for example, a female antagonist, the bad female character, was portrayed as attractive and well-groomed woman who looks really fashionable, have really high self-esteem, as opposed to the female protagonist, the good woman, who was so humble, so invisible to society, so obedient, and so right from every angle you could look at her, that it was over the top. It just looked bland, and it was hard to believe that such humble, innocent people actually exist, especially in Soviet Union. Nowadays we can finally give the villains, that freaky villains, that extravagant villains, that diverse villains, all the love they deserve. And not to mention that many creators intentionally make them beautiful, knowing that we will be simping over them. For example, take Sephiroth from Final Fantasy. He's a villain, but he has the perfect looks. He always shows his ripped bare chest. So a few characters in that universe are as loved by fans as Sephiroth, obviously. And here also goes all kinds of vampires that are conveniently forever young, and for some reason not just young, but they don't seem to quit gym for the few centuries that they live. So they look kind of hot, yeah, like that, like Castlevania, like Helsing, like Vampire Lestat. I can say they are villains, but obviously we can't call this nice citizens, like Blood Rain. She was a protagonist, but she was no saint for sure, and it was my ideal in my childhood. I wanted to be like her when I grow up. Yeah, and let's add a grain of salt to this bell dolphins bathwater, because there are some problems need to be mentioned. And first of all, the obvious one, the romanticizing of toxic relations. It's always important to remember that no matter where your fantasies go, but in real life it's a bad idea trying to fix a villain, a criminal, unless this person asks you for help. But if we're talking about being attached to some obvious terrible people, like when a lot of women try to defend Ted Bundy, a serial killer, or Richard Ramirez, just because they were hot, that's bullshit. You should not do that in real life, because best case scenario, you'll just gain some emotional trauma, and worst case scenario, who knows what these people can do. And another problem I see, personally, I might be a bit biased here, but I feel like there's lack of good female antagonists. Most female villains are just femme fatales. They are evil because they're hot, and they are hot because they are evil. There's rarely a really good sob story behind their past. Usually it's bad storytelling overall when hot look is the only thing you can actually tell about this character. So when someone tells you to describe this one, you can't recall anything really, anything noticeable, except for being good looking. The conclusion. It's an interesting time to be alive. And as well as your fantasies stay fantasies, as long as you don't try to implement sympathizing the evil in real life, that's okay. You can be fanboys or fangirls of whatever the villain you might like. And a small prediction from fortune teller Anna. I think that since in our society, in our culture, often some trends, some events go in circles. So I think this whole story with romanticizing the villains will make a full cycle, will go through a full cycle, and some people will get bored of the story focused on outlaws, on the rebels, and people will start to want see a new generation of protagonists that are ideal, that are something to look up to in attempt to be a better self. Then this will get boring for people too, and they will go back to justifying the villains. So this is just my opinion. It might or might not come true. We'll see. So that's it for today. I was really glad to see you. If you have any favorite villain that you were cheering for more than the main story protagonist, let me know in the comment who that was. And as usual, if you're going to sleep, I wish you all the sweetest dreams. And if not, then I wish you all the best day ahead and no villains in real life. And we'll see each other real soon in the next roleplay episode of ASMR.